We're going to go ahead and kick off our meeting this evening on homelessness. And if you want to stay for that or come back in for that, feel free to do so. We have a lot of ground to cover. This is in follow-up to a meeting we had in June. It was a virtual meeting where we had an opportunity to meet with folks, get questions from people who wanted more information, and hear some thoughts from our community. And this is in follow-up to that meeting, where we hope to be able to share a lot of information with you about homelessness, what we're doing in the community, some of the challenges we have. And I'm going to come back over here because I want to introduce to you the folks we have here tonight. I'm Jason Slowinski, the city manager here in Golden, and with us tonight we have several different people who will speak to this topic, including Kelly Barker, who is our regional homelessness coordinator, and she's actually online on the screen there. She just waved at you, and she'll jump in and be able to present virtually. We also have Rebecca Radabau, who's our homeless navigator on behalf of the City of Golden. She's in the upper right hand corner of your screen. Steve Guest in our police department is there as well. Hi, Steve. We have Lori Strand here in person. Lori Strand works in the city attorney's office and advises the city on legal issues associated with this topic. Our Commander Drew Williams, Commander over Support Services, which leads the police department's efforts in this area. And then lastly, we have a special guest also coming to us on the screen, and that is Randall. Hi, Randall. Randall is a person who previously experienced homelessness and would like to join us today to share some of his thoughts and story. And so we're glad, Randall, you can join us as well. So thank you very much. And Deputy City Manager Carly Lorenz is here, who will join me here at the table as well. And so we'll get started with presentations from a number of these individuals, and then at the end, hopefully we'll have a chance to take some of your questions that you might have and answer those. So I'm going to start with Kelly Barker. Again, Kelly is the Regional Homeless Coordinator, and we'll turn it over to Kelly, and she has, I know, a presentation she'd like to share. Kelly, over to you.
Great. Thank you very much. Can you all see my screen?
Yeah.
The slides?
Yep.
Yes, looks like it. Okay. Well, thanks for having me tonight to speak about this really important issue. I was asked my contribution to really just provide some context on the issue, some data that here locally on this issue of homelessness, and some information about what we're doing in Jefferson County and with all the cities collaboratively to try and develop some solutions to this growing issue here in Jeffco. So this first slide, I just want to show kind of big picture what the data looks like around homelessness here in Jefferson County. So this data in particular is taken from the results of the comprehensive summer count done in 2019, August 2019. So now that's been 2 years now. It was done in August of 2019. So this data is a little out of date, and that's what happens when we rely on kind of census counts, which is what this was. We'll do another census count in January, the point in time count. But this count was a little more comprehensive because it was a month long, and so that was unique, and it was done in the summer. So we think the numbers at the time at least reflect a little more of reality. We don't know yet. We don't know yet through data, like to the extent that COVID and the last year and a half has affected these numbers. We'll get a better sense of that in January. But you'll see Lakewood, of course, has a predominant share of individuals experiencing homelessness here in Jefferson County. The dark blue is unsheltered individuals, and the light blue is sheltered folks. So they're either in emergency shelters or transitional housing, or in a motel that's paid for by public agency. And then Golden down there is the third lowest number, pretty average unsheltered population compared to the rest. Total of 42 individuals that were counted in Golden. Again, we know this is very likely an undercount, but it's what folks outside really counted that over the course of the week that they did the unsheltered count. So drilling down a little bit more into the numbers for Golden, through that count, we found 29 individuals of that 42 were literally homeless. And when we say literally homeless, it's a HUD definition, but it just means folks that are truly either living outside in an emergency shelter or a car, or just a place that's not meant for human habitation. And then 13 were counted at risk, at imminent risk of homelessness. So they've moved several times in the last couple of weeks and didn't know where they'd stay in the next couple of days. So you'll see the predominant share of people, they reported their sleeping location was outside or in a vehicle. In terms of race and ethnicity, I show this slide in all of my presentations because no matter what census count we do, it always shows the same results, and that is a disproportionate share of individuals, persons of color, experience homelessness compared to the general population. And that bears out in Golden, that bears out in every city across Jefferson County and the county as a whole, Denver Metro, nationally, et cetera. And so these numbers really, you can show that a higher percentage of persons of color do experience homelessness. Just to touch on a few kind of myths and truths about homelessness just throughout my work and experience and those that I work with. And these are just some common things that I hear in terms of what it is not. I hear often that homelessness is a choice, or it's just this or just that, or it's this type of person or those people. And, I understand it's easier to kind of try to comprehend an issue through that way of grouping folks, but in buckets, but it's just such a complex issue, and it's really hard to talk about it as a homogenous experience. And I'm really glad Randall's on tonight to talk about his experience. And every single person that goes through this horrific experience has a different story and a different pathway. There's certainly commonalities those pathways. Those pathways are also often little common denominator is poverty, severe poverty throughout their lives, and a lack of affordable housing, which is only getting greater as time goes on, is often a health issue at some point within that experience of homelessness, whether it's before the person experienced homelessness or during or both. Health is often a huge issue, and it only really exacerbates while someone is living outside or in a car or in a shelter. And then just multiple system failures really have created this issue of homelessness, and it's grown in this country as a result. It's everything from family systems to criminal justice systems to health systems to educational systems, and on and on. All of those systems have kind of built-in cracks, and some people, especially that don't have the resources and those safety nets, which are often people living in severe poverty, fall through those cracks fairly easily, and the result is this experience of homelessness. And finally, trauma is also a common denominator. There's some good data on just the commonality. It's almost 100% of people experiencing homelessness have had significant trauma in their life. If they haven't, then they certainly will once they become homeless. And that trauma really affects the brain and the ability to perform higher level tasks and thinking. So it's something that's not seen, but it's really significant in that experience. Just a quick quick slide. I don't like to put people into buckets, but I just show this to say, like, this is kind of depiction of an iceberg, and I like to think of it this way and sometimes explain of, like, just the invisibility of homelessness. Most folks that are housed, or when we're driving around or whatnot, the visibly homeless are generally people that are chronically homeless. So chronically homeless are people that have just have long histories of homelessness and some sort of long-term health condition or disability. So those are the people that we see, and a lot of us think, well, that's the entirety of the problem. That's everyone who experiences homelessness. And that really couldn't be further from the truth. The truth is the vast majority of people that experience homelessness experience it at a rather short term, that maybe fall into homelessness once or twice, that are very employable and well, but they just don't have that safety net. They're very impoverished and don't have any other friends that could catch them if they lose their job or if they have significant health crisis, or on and on. And those people are often families and shelters, or individuals, again, that stay in their car until they get back on their feet or whatnot. So I just show this to show that the data really, you can't really see the vast majority of people that are experiencing homelessness. And a lot of times it's for economic reasons. And so I want to highlight that those reasons are real and they're out there. It's much more than the person that is experiencing those significant behavioral health issues that you visibly see on the street. And then this is kind of another way I found this recently on this really great website called understandhomelessness.com. I thought really had some nice visuals about how to think about homelessness. What are the causes? Again, it's very complex, so it's just, there's lots of different ways to think about it and try to wrap your head around it. And this just shows kind of on the left are those system issues, and then all the way to the right is kind of the person and their ability to work and whatnot. And in between are really those barriers, those challenging areas, which really are the cracks in that system. Those systems that I mentioned, when you have those barriers, it makes it easier to fall through those cracks. So what are we doing locally here? There's an entity, an organization that's existed for, I think, 10 to 15 years in Jefferson County. It was led by a core group of people and organizations, faith-based entities, government officials, nonprofits, that really came together and said, we need to do something to address homelessness. They met many years. They formed Severe Weather Shelter Network. A lot of great initiatives came out of that. In the last year or so, since I came on board, I was really for paid staff to work for Heading Home. And we really start to organize a little more. We've developed a pretty solid action plan, homelessness action plan, that's posted on our website here if you'd like to learn more. But through that action plan, we identified really these four main priorities in which the group is focused on, and there's a number of activities under each of these priorities. So I encourage you, if you're interested, to read more. Crisis resolution system is really, how do we respond to that person who's about to lose housing and has no safety net? How do we respond to someone who's been homeless for 20 years and has acute health issues? And how can we help provide safety and security to people so that they can, get that stability in housing, find that pathway to housing, and ultimately, really find meaning and purpose in life and move beyond homelessness. So that's kind of what we mean by crisis resolution. Supportive housing is really that housing that's designed for that tip of the iceberg that I showed earlier, the individuals that are chronically homeless. That's a really evidence-based model that's very cost-effective as well. That is just rental subsidies, but it also provides support services and supportive services in that housing to help these individuals that stay in supportive housing or more chronically homeless, to help them maintain their housing, which is critically important. So these are individuals that have a lot of barriers and have lots of health needs, typically speaking, and could really benefit from having voluntary supports in the housing. And then the last two are just, as I mentioned earlier, census count is really what we're relying on currently for our data source on this issue, and we really need to have a more dynamic, live source of data to be able to understand how this issue presents in all of the cities, including Golden, and how it's changing over time. And we need that data to be able to tell us how we can respond effectively and use public resources and private resources as effectively and efficiently as possible. We need to know what's working and what's not and all that. So we're working on developing a more robust data collection and data sharing system, primarily through increasing participation in what's called the Homeless Management Information System, which is a very ubiquitously used database in the home service provider world, not so commonly used in JEFCO though. So we're trying to increase our participation in that database so we can know at any given point in time what's happening on this issue and be able to respond appropriately. And then lastly, we have a work group set up increasing community involvement in support of the solutions, and we're working on things like creating educational events throughout the community to learn more about specific issues on homelessness, improving a website that will provide kind of collate all the opportunities to get involved in homelessness, and just really provide opportunities for people to get involved, anybody out there that's interested, and to provide kind of education and information and connection on this issue in the community. Again, that's addressed in that action plan. And so lastly, what have we gotten in place in the last year and a half? We've gotten quite a few initiatives going and are working on some big initiatives as well in Jefferson County, and that includes Golden's certainly a partner in a lot of this work. So the first one being the Homeless Navigation Collaborative. Rebecca will speak more. She's the Golden's homeless navigator, but this was a collaborative formed. It really launched last year, but it was many years in the making. It was a collaborative formed by all of the cities and Jefferson County Human Services that really came together and said, we have this issue. We want to work together to address it, but we also want to have our ability to have a flexible response that's really respond to our local needs in each city. So what they did is hire a homeless navigator in each of the cities, at least one, and then Rebecca is shared currently with Wheat Ridge, Edgewater, and Golden, but the rest of the cities have at least one, some have two, that really work directly with people experiencing homelessness to really identify a pathway to housing and help to break down those barriers that they need to get that housing. Mentioned heading home. So anyway, so this collaborative has been going for a year, and we work informally as a team, and it's been going well. I won't say too much because Rebecca will speak to that. And I'm not going to go into each of these. I'm happy to provide information or answer questions on these. These are just a lot of the things that have just been going in the last year around homelessness that are really going to make a big impact. And then, of course, we have the American Rescue Plan Act, which we are working on developing a plan to use some of those funds, which were specifically earmarked for solutions to homelessness and housing for individuals experiencing homelessness. So those plans are in the works, and we'll certainly open it up to community feedback and input and engagement once those plans kind of get out of the start gate, so to speak. So lastly, just getting involved in the solutions. Again, I mentioned we've just finished up kind of a draft of this website that collates a whole list of ways you can get involved for anybody in any aptitude that wants to get involved. And this is all listed on that Heading Home Get Involved page, all the details of that. So that concludes my presentation. I can turn it back to whoever is facilitating.
Thanks. Let me try to get this back on again.
Yes.
Button.
Yep, that's the one. When it's red, it's on, so for some reason.
Shake it 5 times.
Try this one. You're a little temperamental.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you, Kelly. That was a very informative presentation. We appreciate that. We want to get into more specifics about some of the things Golden is working on and some of the challenges we have. But before we do that, I want to bring in our guest Randall here, and I see him up on the screen, and Randall has graciously agreed to be here tonight and share some of his personal experience with homelessness, and I think it will be enlightening for folks tonight to hear from Randall. So Randall, will you introduce yourself and take it away from here?
Yes, thank you. As always, it's an honor to be able to share with you.
In full screen. Oh, you did it. Perfect. I would say I can.
And to take this time to help to paint a picture, a scenario of losses and struggles and bravado and just persevering. Resilience is the name of the game for most of us. I'm nearly 71 years of age, and I was about 20 years ago on the advent of 9/11 in a ICU unit at Presbyterian St. Luke's Hospital, attempting to kill myself from an overdose of sleeping pills. I had been trying since my daughters came to visit me, and it was a disaster in 1995, and my youngest child was in a near-fatal car accident in Philadelphia, where our family is and where I'm from. I crossed the Mississippi to this area in the late 70s and went to Iowa School of Theology and graduated in 1981 with a Master of Divinity degree, especially in pastoral care and counseling and education. And I had always expected to be a public servant, and in many respects I am. But I did not expect to be a burden, as I have seen it, to almost everybody who ever loved me. I was recently tested, although this is a brand new day, for Asperger's syndrome, a form of it, that I once lived with a person who went to the open school, who had been diagnosed as being autistic from an early age. And in the time that I grew up, nobody had any understanding at all of illnesses and health problems related to brain chemistry. And for me, this was pivotal to my understanding what's going on. Why is it that everybody in my family functions, including my children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and I continue to force myself to carry on? I've had the great blessing of being a part of Stout Street Health Center, which is a qualified health center, federally qualified, and be able to weather the storms that rage in me. I work for Bayard Enterprises as the main custodial person taking care of their main office. And I've been involved all of my life in working, but in my case, it has not been sufficient for me to have a roof over my head. At the moment, because I was introduced as having solved this, I'm living in protective action at Aloft Hotel downtown. That's me in my room. The background is just a background. And I'm going to be ending this as of the time they close it in September, and still don't know how I will afford a place to live. I spoke to the Denver Regional Council of Governments about this matter a few times, and I said that we have an enormous burden to ensure that people are safe. And I have always been a person who's conscientious. I'm on many boards and serve in many capacities in the public interest, including Heading Home, which I'm honored to be a part of. And I know that many, many people are working their whole lives to ensure that people like me are safe. And without those interdependent connections, I would definitely not be alive. So I'm grateful. I feel blessed, even in the struggles. Most of us who are in this situation have early childhood trauma, and I'm no exception. Even though I came from a home that was very successful, and my father a lawyer with the Social Security Administration, my mother a professional actress on stage, and I just was different than my family members, even my children. And it's hard for anyone to understand the distinction between your method of thinking, as it's explained by Temple Grandin in her book Thinking in Pictures, and the way in which most people operate. They simply don't have the experience of the dark nights of the soul. And that's, of course, a biblical reference. Because where is it that we belong? Where is our home? In fact, how is it that we define that? And I'm extremely educated, but what difference does that make? It has to be possible for us to provide shelter from the storm and permanent housing and permanent supportive services for most of the people who we encounter in our daily lives, who in many cases are ignored, and mostly because of the fact that we don't understand. We're afraid. We think that their poverty will rub off on us. But in fact, the possibility is that all of us can take care and be a part of this community. And I've spoken to this countless times, that there are places in the world where they're extended, like in Geel in Belgium, homes for a person who has a disability so that they are safe. And they don't have to worry about whether or not they have a place to live for their whole life. There was a film made about it. There's been several different ones, but one that strikes me is this one about a sheriff there in the town. And his mother took care of somebody who had been a stranger. And when she died, his sister took over the responsibility of sheltering this person in a personal way. The only resources that they offered, unlike our foster care system, was to make sure that he had health checks at the community hospital. And the small stipend was offered, but the fact of the matter is they considered that to be a historic impetus for them to care for other people who had been suffering and did not have a place to go. And it was based actually on a real person who was thrown out by her father and for whom they made her a patron saint. And in her experience, she could not bear to see anybody else in a situation similar to hers. Now, I'm a writer, and I've traveled a great deal in the time I've been homeless, mostly as a member of the Denver Voice newspaper staff and an editor. And by the way, I'm making a plug right now. I'm writing a book called A Short Bio of a Man with a Brain on Fire, in case you're ever interested in studying what I have to say more in depth. And the fascinating thing is that these efforts to life share, it's called citizen advocacy, is something that is common in many parts in the world. And the reason why is because they consider it to be an ethical responsibility to take care of every person in their community. And so I encourage you to explore alternatives to the standard housing voucher or subsidized unit or ADU, accessory dwelling unit, or whatever you describe it as, because these are not sufficient for many of our individuals who need more of a touch than we have offered. And in my case, I've been working with this since I was first diagnosed around the age of 50. And I don't believe that this will ever change in my care and time, because as much as I love to work and take care of the community in which I live, I recognize that in some cases we are invisible, we're forgotten, we're looked upon as essentially in the way, we're a burden. And by no means am I a burden. And many of my friends and colleagues are of the same ilk. We possess tremendous gifts and talents, and we're really fortunate to be able to share our wisdom and our experience. In fact, I'm going through a peer mentoring training program in late October through the mental health service, and I'm hopeful to be a mental health peer mentor for people who suffer and have suffered the same as I have. So even though I may be what I am, I'm not done. None of us are. Well, thank you for listening to me.
Thank you very much, Randall. I think we've all benefited from hearing your story, and your desire for public service, no doubt, has been fulfilled in part here tonight in sharing your story. I'm going to go a little bit out of order, and since we have the benefit of Randall here, does anybody have any questions of Randall that he might be able to answer? If not, I want to say thank you again, Randall, and I appreciate you spending time with us tonight. Very much appreciated. Next on our agenda is to bring back in Rebecca Rodabow. She is Golden's Homelessness Navigator. Rebecca actually is an employee of the city of Wheat Ridge. However, Wheat Ridge, Golden, and Edgewater all share the services of Rebecca and her duties as a homeless navigator. So Rebecca, welcome, and we'd like to take a minute and hear from you. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you. As I was introduced, my name is Rebecca Rodabaugh, and I am the homeless navigator for Golden, Wheat Ridge, and Edgewater. And kind of what Kelly was talking a little bit on our countywide navigation model, my role was part of this new countywide navigation model that was launched in 2020, comprised of 6 municipal and county-based housing navigators in Jefferson County who work directly with persons experiencing homelessness or at imminent risk of homelessness. As the homeless navigator, my primary role is to navigate persons experiencing a housing crisis into stable housing and help them obtain the services and resources needed to obtain and maintain that housing. While I don't add to the number of housing resources available, I directly help persons experiencing homelessness to identify solutions to complex health and housing challenges and support those persons seeking a pathway out of homelessness. I work closely with the local businesses, community partners, constituents, metro area nonprofit providers, and government agencies. I currently have a referral process that I work with the courts and the police department with to refer those individuals who they come into contact with and are experiencing homelessness and wanting some resources. Additionally, I've been conducting weekly outreach in Golden. I'm in Golden at least every Thursday from 11 to 12 at the First United Methodist Church during the meal times. Being at the same place and same time each week helps remove that barrier for those individuals who don't have any contact information. They know where I'm at and they know where they can find me each week and don't have to worry about trying to call me or email me if they don't have access to that. And the idea while I'm out on outreach and checking in with these individuals is to slowly build trust and rapport. So with those individuals who have had negative interactions with service providers or police, hopefully they'll be more willing to trust me over time and work with me towards stable housing or any other resources they may be in need of. And kind of to touch a little bit more on outreach, sometimes it takes 3 to 5 times for me to check in with individuals and kind of introduce myself and conduct outreach before they feel they can trust me and start working with me. And that kind of goes back to having negative experiences with previous service providers or the police department. And when I meet with an individual, so first I complete an intake with them that kind of assesses the client's needs and barriers. These intakes ask questions around how long the individual has been experiencing homelessness, disabilities, mental health, substance use, income, and the reasons the client feels contributed to their homelessness. These intakes are all self-report data, meaning I can pull the data on what the individuals are identifying as their barriers as opposed to what I think their barriers may be. And I found that the more rapport and trust I built with clients, the more clients are willing to be open and honest when I'm asking these questions. And these questions help me make sure that I'm providing the appropriate resources to the clients contingent on their barriers. After completing an intake, I work with the client to identify a pathway towards housing. Depending on a client's circumstances and barriers, the time it takes to house a client can differ. And it really just depends. It's very different per client and what that looks like and what housing looks like to them. And so in an ideal situation where an individual has all of their vital docs, their birth certificate, ID, and social security card, and if everything fell into place perfectly, I could potentially house someone in 6 months, or it could take up to a couple of years. It really just depends on the individual and what their circumstances are. But I just kind of wanted to highlight how long the pathway towards housing could end up being and how it's different for every individual. To date, the Homeless Navigation Program has completed an intake with 45 clients. That's 2 in Edgewater, 13 in Golden, and 30 in Wheat Ridge. Of that number, I've had 4 clients exit the Homeless Navigation Program, either to stable housing or due to being deceased. And then I had an additional client who hasn't exited yet, but just signed a lease yesterday. I'm also working with 5 additional clients with either their apartment search or gathering information to apply for a voucher. From conducting outreach, I've had many clients reach out and inquire about resources or kind of speak with me while I'm on outreach about resources and working towards stable housing. And one of those clients that I've been working very closely with and been outreaching for months now, probably since February, I've been outreaching this individual. They recently stated they wanted to work with me and start working towards stable housing, and they were selected for a housing voucher. Even though this person is selected for a housing voucher, it's still a very long process before they get to stable housing. This individual is currently living unsheltered, meaning that every day they don't know where their next meal is coming from, where they're going to be able to use the restroom, or where they're even going to be able to find a safe place to sleep at night. On top of those barriers this individual faces on a daily basis, they still have to figure out how to make it to their necessary appointments, whether it's for housing, community agencies, or anyone working with them, and getting their housing documents. Additionally, they don't have access to a phone or computer, and oftentimes one of their barriers is just figuring out what time it is. Because they're so focused on getting their basic needs met. And they oftentimes also don't have access to a shower before going to these appointments. And since they don't have access to a phone, they may not be able to call to let someone know if they're running late or if they mistaken the time for an hour or two before. And so I wanted to share a story with another individual and kind of the impact it's had on their life. So I'm working with one individual who lost their job at the beginning of the pandemic. And after they lost their job, they then lost their housing, and they were living in their vehicle, but then lost their vehicle as well. And as a result of this, they're currently living on the streets. So every day they're unsure of where they're going to sleep at night, if they'll even be safe while sleeping. They also reported they're actively looking for employment employment, but oftentimes they have to put the search on hold to ensure that their basic needs are met daily. Another barrier this individual is facing is storing their belongings. If they leave their belongings unattended, they may be stolen, as many of their belongings have been stolen in the past. Therefore, everywhere this client goes, they carry their belongings with them, meaning that if they go to a job interview or they're going to access services at a community agency, they carry their belongings with them. And not only is it a physical strain on their body, but it's a mental strain on having to continuously worry about their safety and getting their basic needs met. And additionally, this client has reported that if they show up with all of their belongings where they may not have had a shower that morning, they don't feel confident going into a job interview and feel like they're going to be unable to secure the job. And these are just sample examples of two of the clients that I'm working with. Every individual has their own barriers and struggles. Therefore, I work with each individual on a case-by-case basis to ensure that they're receiving the resources that are right for them. Kind of as mentioned before, everybody's barriers are different and how they react to them is different. And so it's very a case-by-case individualized plan that I work with everyone on. For more information about homelessness or resources or frequently asked questions, you can visit the city's Guiding Golden page or the city's website. And I encourage anyone to reach out with any questions they may have about the Homeless Navigation Program. Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca. Appreciate the overview of your work here in Golden and across Wheat Ridge and Edgewater. And although I will say your background is not as cool as Randall's. We're going to shift gears a little bit, and I'm going to introduce Lori Strand, who's part of our city attorney's office and has worked extensively in this area. And then we'll get into talking more specifics about some of the things Golden is working on, some of the challenges that we face from our police department and other areas. One of the challenges for sure is a complex legal environment which limits what we might be able to do as a city government. And so Lori will certainly give us an overview of some of those issues. And so Lori, why don't you take it away, and thanks for being here.
Sure. Okay, can folks hear me if I don't slouch over? So it's... Okay, I'll move it closer. This is actually the first time I've spoken in front of a live audience for about 16 months now, and the first time I've spoken into a microphone for longer than that. So it's thrilling to be in front of live and in-person people. But again, my name is Lori Strand. I'm with the firm Michelle Cox McCaskin, and we've recently joined with the City of Golden as the City Attorney's Office. And tonight I'm going to really focus, and I do have a slide presentation actually. I'm going to focus my conversation on constitutional issues that often arise when cities are thinking about how to legislate matters that arise related to homelessness, and the things that cities and law enforcement need to think about when they're deciding whether to take enforcement action, the constitutional issues, that is. I'll touch very briefly one slide on local ordinances that somewhat commonly come up when we are trying to address homeless issues out in the public, but I'm really going to let Jason and Commander Williams speak more directly to Golden's code and the city's philosophy as I'm still learning the local issues. So next slide, Pete, please. So there are, 3 amendments in the United States Constitution, and there are kind of corresponding amendments in the Colorado Constitution, but I'm going to focus on the United States constitutional provisions that really arise in the case law and in these issues, and we'll kind of walk through each of them rather quickly. I've been allotted about 15 minutes. I'll probably take a little bit longer. But we're going to talk a little bit about the 8th Amendment, and specifically the cruel and unusual punishment provision. We are going to talk about the 4th and 14th Amendments as they relate to the clearing and cleaning up of encampments. And we're going to talk about the First Amendment and how free speech relates to panhandling and what some people refer to as anti-begging laws. And like I said, we're going to speak, I'm going to speak really briefly on here's some local ordinances that are out there, and then I'm going to let folks that know a bit more than me at this point in time to speak to those. So I live in the city of Wheat Ridge, and Wheat Ridge recently held a session like this, and so I listened to it. And a comment that was made by their city attorney, I'm cribbing because I think it really is illustrative of where the courts have been going over the course of the last 5 years, 10 years. And really that's an increasing willingness on courts to say that laws cannot punish people for experiencing homelessness. That just like those of us that are housed, we all are afforded the protections of the Constitution, and courts more and more are acknowledging that, and that this is not solely a law enforcement issue, and that is consistent with Golden Police Department's philosophy and the City of Golden's philosophy. I will note as I go through the issues that you might notice, you might not, that the cases that I'm going to speak to, the ones in Colorado are lower court decisions. We do not have a lot of Colorado Supreme Court or 10th Circuit or even appellate court decisions that really speak to some of the issues that we're talking about right now. So you'll see that I'm speaking and I'm pulling recent case law from the 9th Circuit because the 9th Circuit has been looked to by some of the lower court cases in Colorado as guidance. I will say that there is currently a case that's from Denver that is making its way to the 10th Circuit. So we may have more guidance that is precedential in the state of Colorado in the not too distant future, but the courts take some time. So with that lead in, next slide please. We're going to start with the Eighth Amendment, and this really comes up with respect to camping bans, and Golden does have one. Many jurisdictions have camping bans that prohibit sleeping in public places. So there's been a number of cases that have come up in this regard. And what the Eighth Amendment says is that, you know, the state, the federal government, the local government shall not inflict cruel and unusual punishments. And that is the language that courts key in on when they're looking at camping bans and the enforcement of camping bans. So next slide, please. So just a couple years ago, the 9th Circuit, again, Colorado's in the 10th Circuit, so this is not legally precedential or binding on our courts, but our lower courts have looked to this decision, which is why I'm putting it up here, did address a camping ordinance and a disorderly conduct ordinance that was enacted and enforced by the city of Boise. In that case, there were a number of homeless individuals that were cited for violating those ordinances, which effectively banned folks from sleeping, for sleeping in public parks and on sidewalks in the community. And so the court looked at the issue, looked at the facts of the case, and acknowledged that there were significantly more individuals experiencing homelessness in the community than there were shelters or beds to provide a place for people to sleep. So with that in mind, the court held, if you would, the next slide, that the Eighth Amendment, the cruel and unusual punishment provision of the Eighth Amendment, precludes the enforcement of a statute prohibiting sleeping outside against homeless individuals who have no access to available shelter. So that was, some folks say, a landmark sort of case because it was probably the first case that was so favorable to homeless individuals challenging these types of ordinances. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to put up this slide because I think it really goes to the heart of the issue and to my first statement about the court's willingness, growing willingness to recognize this kind of shift, that this is not a law enforcement issue solely, and it's a social issue. And so this language, I think, is really telling. So the court wrote that sitting, lying, and sleeping are universal and an unavoidable consequence of being human, that human beings are biologically compelled to rest. And importantly, just as the state may not criminalize the state or the status of being homeless in public places, the state may not criminalize conduct that is an unavoidable consequence of being human, and any such punishment, in the Ninth Circuit's view, violates the Eighth Amendment. Next slide, please. So, like I said, there are some Colorado District Court cases, one arising in Denver, another arising in Fort Collins, that cited to the Ninth Circuit Boise case when they looked at whether or not those jurisdictions' ordinances that banned camping were constitutional with respect to particular individuals. So in the Denver case, Denver has an ordinance that says it's unlawful to camp on any public property without express approval. And there's procedural requirements that are laid out in Denver's ordinance that law enforcement must follow before they either issue a citation or arrest an individual who may be sleeping in public, camping in public. So in this case, the trial court's factual findings were that the defendant was in fact homeless and that he was in fact camping on public property. The trial court found that the police gave the defendant the option to go to shelter, and on that particular evening, the shelters were not full. There were beds available that particular night. It was only after the defendant refused the offer of shelter that he was issued a citation. However, he was not arrested. He voluntarily took down his camp and left the public premises at the time. So on those facts, and looking to the Ninth Circuit decision, the court held, next slide please, that it was constitutional, that the application of Denver's ordinance under those particular facts was constitutional. And the court emphasized that the camping ordinance would be unconstitutional only in limited situations where no alternative shelter is available. So that's a Denver situation. There was a different decision in Fort Collins, and this came down just, I believe it was in February. So next slide, please. So again, City of Fort Collins has a similar no camping on public property. This gentleman was cited for sleeping in his car on public property. In this case, the court found that there were no beds in the two city shelters that were available to the defendant. And I kind of embolden a defendant on this slide just to remind myself that, there are some interesting facts in this case. At the time of this case, and I don't know in Fort Collins if this remains the case, but there are two shelters within the city limits, and the defendant worked for one of them. And under an anti-fraternization policy, the defendant was not allowed to interact with clients outside of working hours while he was working. So he was not allowed to use beds at that location of the first shelter. So it was also found in the record that that first shelter was in fact full the night he was cited. With respect to the second shelter, the defendant testified that he was concerned for his safety if he were to go there, because as part of his role as an employee at the first shelter, he had to sometimes suspend individuals from staying at the first shelter, and so he was worried that if he came across them at the second shelter, he may not be safe. It was also in the record of this case that that second shelter was full, but they weren't yet turning away clients that evening. There was also some other interesting facts. The defendant said he said that he had no choice, and this kind of, I think Kelly spoke to, this myth that homelessness is a choice. The defendant said he had no choice but to sleep outdoors, and the city questioned that. And some of the reasons the city questioned that was because the defendant had a job, he had a working car. He testified that he did not go to Loveland or any neighboring communities to see if there was another place to stay. He testified that he'd been homeless for 2 years because he was trying to pay down credit card debt. He had really excessive debt, and he couldn't pay down his debt, and he said and rent at the same time. And he did not, because of his own beliefs, did not want to go into bankruptcy and did not want his debts to go into collections. He also testified that he didn't look for another job. He liked his job. So the city wanted to push the court to really look into this question of, was this a voluntary situation? Is this really a situation where it's cruel and unusual punishment because the defendant's making a choice, the city said. And I'm kind of paraphrasing. I wasn't there, but this is what I gleaned from the case. So the court said, and again, this is a lower level court, declined to do an in-depth analysis, if you would, the next slide, of whether or not the defendant was voluntarily homeless. And the court said instead that the law is clear that shelter availability determines the standard of voluntary or involuntary homelessness. And there were no shelters available in the city of Fort Collins the night that he was cited. So citing him was cruel and unusual under the 8th Amendment. I believe the newspapers have reported that Fort Collins is not appealing this decision. And again, this is not precedential to other courts, but there's some strong language in there, and Fort Collins is not challenging it. Okay, next slide. So we have all seen, I'm sure, over the course of the last year, plenty of news reports about mass sweeps, clearing of encampments, different languages used in the city and county of Denver. Again, we don't have precedential law in the state of Colorado, so I'm going to cite again to the Ninth Circuit and talk about some things that may be going up from some challenges that occurred in Denver. But there are two constitutional provisions that come up when a local jurisdiction seeks to clean up or clear encampments, and that's the Fourth Amendment. And the Fourth Amendment is the amendment that provides people with protection against unreasonable searches and unreasonable seizures. Next slide, please. The other constitutional provision that comes into play when we're talking about clearing or cleaning up of encampments is the 14th Amendment. Folks may be more familiar with this one, but the 14th Amendment protects people from the deprivation of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. So these are the two issues that come up. Next slide, please. So in 2012, the Ninth Circuit addressed an issue where several homeless individuals that were living in the Skid Row district claimed that the city violated both their 4th and 14th Amendment rights by seizing and immediately destroying their unabandoned personal property that they temporarily left on public sidewalks. And what the case talks about is that many of the individuals were just doing things that life demands, going to the restroom, taking a shower, going to court, looking for a job, but they temporarily left their property on the public sidewalk. And so they argued that the city, by seizing it and immediately destroying them without giving them the opportunity to retrieve their property, violated their constitutional rights. So Los Angeles argued that these constitutional provisions did not apply, and the way I read it, they had two reasons for that. One, they pointed to the fact that they had a local ordinance that said that persons were not allowed to keep their property on the sidewalk. And the court kind of dismissed that argument, saying basically a local ordinance cannot trump constitutional protections under the 4th Amendment and 14th Amendment. The other argument that the city made was that you need to have a right to privacy in order to have a right to not have your property unreasonably seized, that they go hand in hand. And the court rejected that argument too. Next slide, please. So the court pointed out that the Fourth Amendment protects two types of expectations, one involving unreasonable searches and one involving unreasonable seizures. And in this case, we're dealing with unreasonable seizures. So whether or not something is a seizure, the court said the constitutional standard is whether there was some meaningful interference with appellee's possessory interest in their property. And if there was a meaningful interference, the next question is, was it reasonable? So that's the test that the Ninth Circuit announced. And they had held in this case that the city's immediate destruction, seizure and immediate destruction, was a violation of their Fourth Amendment rights. Next slide, please. So with respect to the second challenge that the homeless individuals in this case made was that the 14th Amendment provides them with procedural due process protections. And I'm not going to go deeply into this, but the first step when you're questioning whether or not somebody has a 14th Amendment right to procedural due process is whether or not they have a property right. And the court quickly concluded that yes, they do, that both the Supreme Court and California law recognizes personal property as a property right. And so the continued possessory interest in their, it was their papers, their identification, their tents, blankets, all of those things, they had a right. So they should have been afforded procedural due process. So the court here said that protections apply and required the city to take reasonable steps to give notice that the property had been taken so that the owner could pursue remedies for its return. So, on both claims, the Fourth Amendment and the 14th Amendment, the Ninth Circuit found in the homeless individual's favor. Next slide, please. So, while in a prior life, I did work for the city and county of Denver. It was well before these cases, so I will not speak in much detail about these cases because particularly the Denver Homeless Out Loud case is making its way to the 10th Circuit. But the reason I wanted to kind of put them up here is that, at the federal district court level in the state of Colorado, they recognized similar rights. Whether or not they were violated or not in the Denver Homeless Out Loud instance is to be determined because it's on appeal. In the Lyle v. Denver case, there was a settlement agreement that was reached. This was the class action lawsuit, and a settlement agreement was reached with the city and county of Denver, where Denver agreed, it's a very long settlement, but among other things, to provide a certain amount of notice before they did any sort of mass sweeps subject to emergency type situations, and that they would follow a certain process to allow folks to try to retrieve property once it's been taken. In the Denver Homeless Out Loud case, one of the claims that was made was that the city breached its contract. It breached that settlement agreement, but I'm not sure that that's an issue on appeal. I think the issue on appeal is really the application of the 4th and 14th Amendment. That said, next slide, please. In both of those cases, Denver did not dispute whether or not folks had a property interest. They acknowledged that folks had a property interest in the property that they had confiscated. So this is just the general rule for procedural due process, that it requires notice and an opportunity to be heard, typically before government deprivation. However, the courts recognize that this rule may be disregarded in extraordinary situations where the government interest justifies postponing a hearing until after the event. In order to figure out if an extraordinary situation arises, the courts are required to consider the individual's interest, the risk that the city's making a mistake in the treatment of property. One of the things that cities do when they do these cleanups is that they make this determination on whether something is trash or hazardous or something that can be tagged and saved. So the risk of error is quite high. And then the government's interest. And Denver has argued strongly that the government's interest in the situations that arose this past year were quite high, and that the conditions of the particular sites were a risk to public health, to safety, and so that will be played out. The Fourth Amendment, next slide. Again, both Denver court cases also recognized that there is a right under the Fourth Amendment. It's just whether or not that right was violated in this circumstance that will have to be played out. But again, they use similar language as the Ninth Circuit in stating that a seizure under the Fourth Amendment occurs when there is meaningful interference with an individual's possessory interest in the property. If meaningful interference occurred, the reasonableness must be judged, the Denver court said, the federal district court in Denver said, by balancing the nature and quality of the intrusion and the governmental interest. So kind of similar test under both constitutional provisions, but hopefully we'll get some guidance from the 10th Circuit as this makes its way up the courts. So I just want to I think the Fourth and 14th Amendment are quite challenging. It's my understanding that Golden does not have encampments that we've seen in other jurisdictions in recent years, at least not of the size and magnitude, clearly, that you see in Denver. But, you know, the things that local governments need to consider under the law that's out there is, you know, how much notice, advance notice, is appropriate. What type of notice? How do you get the word out? I read in the paper today about an individual who was in New York and he was an unsheltered individual for several years, and he had always stayed in the same spot. And just yesterday, he had something tagged on his bag saying, "This is going to be gone in a day." So, what's effective notice? How do you give notice? Will it pass that procedural due process test? That's not exactly cleared and laid out in the law. How much time should an affected person be given to gather and move their property? Some of the complaints raised in Denver's instance, in Denver's cleanups, is that, you know, folks had no time. Folks that perhaps were physically disabled had even less time, considering their condition. So those are some of the factual disputes that have arisen in the Denver cases. How does a city determine if property should be preserved or thrown away, or what might be hazardous? So those are things that need to be worked out and figured out. And then from there, what are the procedures for tagging, storing, and providing opportunities for individuals to retrieve that property? And how do you get that message out? I think that there's some, and again, I think that there are some facts that are alleged in Denver's context, was just how few people were able to actually retrieve property, even though it was stored and under the settlement agreement. I think Denver ended up storing property for longer than was required, but folks still didn't retrieve it, or perhaps it wasn't found, it wasn't tagged right. So it's really quite challenging. Next slide. And I know I've gone over my 15 minutes, but this is the last one. So the First Amendment, you know, this is seen as a bedrock of our country, of our society, that Congress, which kind of trickles down to the states and local governments, shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. And where does this come up? This comes up in panhandling or anti-begging laws that we've seen and that have evolved over the last 10 years because of the case I'm about to mention. So next slide, please. Before I get into the panhandling case law, there was a First Amendment case. It was actually a sign code case that came out of the town of Gilbert in Arizona. And in that case, for those who kind of geek out on sign law, and I know some people that do that, I can give you their names. This was a watershed case. And the reason that this was a watershed case and has really impacted local governments and state governments across the board is because the Supreme Court of the United States made very clear that if somebody challenges a restriction that is imposed on speech, the very first thing that a court must do is determine if that restriction is content-based or content-neutral. And if it's content-based, it's presumptively unconstitutional. And the court has to apply the strict scrutiny standard, that's a legal term, strict scrutiny standard, which will put the onus on the government that enacted that restriction on speech to show that it has a compelling government interest and that the restriction that it enacted is the least restrictive means of furthering that compelling government interest. It's a very hard test. So the way that I think about, in a very simple way, of what's content-based and what's content-neutral, in my mind, if you have to listen to what the person says, or you have to read the words on the sign or the paper to understand or to determine if the regulation applies, that's content-based. If I have to say, oh, she said that, this restriction applies. Oh, he wrote that, this restriction applies. It's likely content-based. And so again, that makes it presumptively unconstitutional. So that's played out in the anti-begging law, the panhandling law jurisprudence across the country. So next slide. And here in Colorado, again, district court case, but I believe, I don't want to say it if it's wrong, so I won't say it. I believe this may have been appealed cert may have been denied, but I'm not sure if that's this case or one of the earlier cases. So we'll just not make any assumptions. But in the city of Grand Junction, it had a panhandling law, like many across the country and many across the state of Colorado, that prohibited panhandling at night, prohibited panhandling if the individual doing it made repeated requests for money or for employment or for something else of value, if they panhandled within 20 feet of ATMs or bus stops, if they panhandled in public parking areas, if they panhandled to folks that were kind of a captive audience, people that may have been, dining in an outside area or standing in line. And importantly, to the case was that the city ordinance defined panhandling as knowingly approaching, accosting, or stopping another person in a public place and soliciting that person, whether by spoken words, bodily gestures, written signs, or other means, and importantly, for money, employment, or other thing of value. So that's the language from the ordinance that was challenged. So if you're applying that, is that content-based, is that content neutral? You have to read it and say, what did they ask for in order to know if those restrictions on doing it at night or doing it repeatedly or doing it by an ATM applies. If somebody walked up to somebody else knowingly, stopped them, and said, can you give me directions to the nearest public restroom, the restrictions would not apply. So next slide, please. So the court held this is content-based, and the timing was really contemporaneous with that Supreme Court decision that I just spoke about. I mean, who knows if the decision would have come down, a year earlier, where they would have gone? But they were guided by Reed. They were bound to Reed. It's the Supreme Court, and they said that those prohibitions were content-based, so strict scrutiny applies. The court did acknowledge, the city of Grand Junction said, we're doing this for purposes of public safety. And the court said, yep, public safety, that is a compelling government interest. You've kind of hit that first mark. However, the city failed to show that the prohibited activities, panhandling at night, panhandling by an ATM, panhandling when people are standing in line, were inherently dangerous or threatening. And not only that, there was nothing, even if you put inherently around, there was no record, there was no study, there was nothing to support that those particular prohibitions address that compelling interest of public safety. And particularly, it was not the least restrictive means. So those were stricken. So following Grand Junction, across the state, across the country, those sorts of provisions have been stricken, and I believe that happened in Golden, too. This case was brought by the ACLU, and wisely, the ACLU did not challenge provisions that are often referred to as aggressive panhandling, where there's a kind of a threatened behavior or there's physical touch. That was not challenged. So that was not stricken. Those still stand. You still see those in ordinances across the country. So that was a wise litigious choice by the ACLU to set those aside. That's so what you'll see now most often across the country is those aggressive sort of actions, those threatening sort of actions, if there's physical interaction, that would be prohibited. So let's see. I do have one more, but I'll spare you for now and see if it comes up in conversation. But as promised, I'm briefly just going to throw up on the screen that as a newbie to the Golden Code, I read the Golden Code, and these are things that popped out as provisions that probably commonly arise when law enforcement and the city is determining whether or not to take action against folks that may be living, staying, sleeping, lying, resting in the city. What's not on there is that there's also a ban on camping in public property laid out in the park section of the code. we've already talked about that obviously the city needs to consider the constitutional issues before it takes any of these actions. And so I'm going to let, I think Jason's speaking next, because this is my last slide. He's going to talk, I think, about, I'll introduce you, what Golden's doing, some things the city's doing, and then I know that Commander Williams is going to talk more about, you know, the police department's philosophy and what they think about before they decide whether to issue citations or make arrests when some of these things come up, as well as other things. So, thank you very much.
Thank you, Lori. It is still on. Good. I thought I would burn through another microphone. Thank you for being here, and thanks for the presentation. A lot of challenging legal issues for sure, which I know we'll get into a little bit more when we talk to Commander Williams. I think it's fair to say that, you know, in the last several years, you notice the visibility of homeless individuals on the streets of Golden probably more than you have in past years. I think that number is increasing. And we're not alone, as demonstrated by some of the numbers that were shared with you across our region and county. But the response to that from people in the community often is if they encounter somebody who may be resting or sleeping or you know, asking for money or whatever it might be, it's either ignore them, some might help them, offer a meal, offer some money, and the other common one is call the city and ask us to do something about it. And we get that quite frequently. And in reality, I think there's two aspects to that question of that. You know, that's when our involvement really comes into this issue. But there's two aspects to that. It's how do we help folks who are experiencing homelessness, and then there are some on the other side who, you know, they don't want to see it, and they ask us to get rid of the problem. And in reality, for us, you know, one of the charges of local government, probably the main charge, is to protect the health, safety, and welfare of our community and those who are in our community, whether they have a home or not. That's part of our role as well. Because as we all know, homelessness is not a crime. And these are complex issues. These are folks who come to this issue from all different sorts of angles, and so we have to try to find ways to meet them where they're at, so we can be impactful on their lives. So I want to share with you just a few things that we've been working on as a city, and then I'll have Commander Williams talk to you a little bit about some of the challenges they face when we're asked to intervene and deal with issues from a city standpoint. Kelly Barker and Rebecca Rodabaugh talked to you about the regional navigation program. I just want to give you a little bit of background on that. Back in 2016, it was the fall of 2016, elected officials from all of the cities in Jefferson County got together, held sort of a regional summit, and the purpose of that get-together was to identify things within our county that would benefit from us working together as a region on. And so we talked about things like transportation and affordable housing and all sorts of things. But the one topic that came up over and over again was homelessness, and what could we do better as a region to help have a positive impact on that issue. And so that was the one that the group decided, let's focus on this. Let's see if we can make some inroads as a region, knowing that not any one of our cities, Golden, Lakewood, Wheat Ridge, Arvada, can solve the problem alone. We have to work together. Otherwise, in many ways, we're shifting the problem between cities, and that does nothing to help solve it. And so this concept of regional navigation program came up, and one of the things that struck me from the early days of those conversations was there are already a lot of resources out there. through not-for-profits, churches, other agencies, organizations. But it was so difficult to follow that. Even for me, trying to understand, put myself in that position of, where do I go for what thing, right? And so this program was really an effort to try to address some of those gaps and create more coordination between the different cities in Jefferson County to get better data that would help us better understand the issues and challenges we faced. The point in time count was referenced. That has been extremely helpful to understand where homeless individuals are in our cities, how many are in our cities, where these issues are. I thought, as part of that exercise, one of the great things was the personal interviews of folks experiencing homelessness and understanding how they got to that situation. Not just the number, but the story behind the number, because that's important to understand. And then, through this program, our goal, as Rebecca talked about, is trying to better match individuals that are experiencing homelessness with resources that are out there. So this has been a work in progress for a number of years. I think we've made some tremendous strides. Having Kelly here and Rebecca, just to have folks who are dedicated to this effort on a regional collaboration has been fantastic, and we continue to work on as a county and city governments collaborate on trying to identify how we can get a permanent shelter in place here in Jefferson County to help homeless individuals. We've worked in collaboration to put in place what's called the Safe Parking Program. I know some of you probably have heard of that. And actually, it's First United Methodist Church that hosts it. And the idea is to provide a safe, legal place for someone to sleep, and if they're experiencing homelessness and they're in their vehicle, a place where they can go. Have access to resources there, have a restroom, have a place to spend a night without having to worry about where to go. And so the city's been supportive of that effort. We've provided some funding for restrooms, and of course, if necessary, our law enforcement can be there as well to help. We have a co-responder program in place that the Golden Police Department participates in, and I know Drew will probably touch on that. But this is really to address those who are experiencing mental health challenges, and our police department has utilized this program in conjunction with other cities. It has been very successful, and we actually hope to expand it further in 2022, assign additional resources for it. Recognizing that not every issue related to homelessness should or needs to involve law enforcement. And that's one of the challenges Drew and his team faces all the time. And the other thing we need to acknowledge and recognize is that the amount of hours that get consumed by working on these issues, just listening to Lori talk about the notice requirements and how you have to go through that analysis on every situation to figure out that you're, as a government, that we're protecting individuals' constitutional rights and not overstepping those bounds. It's an extensive analysis. It requires a lot of time and hours, and those are challenges we continue to face. We get calls regularly for trash cleanup. If folks see a person who might be experiencing homelessness on a corner asking for money, if there's trash there, it's assumed that well, we should just come in and clean that up. There's challenges as Lori noted with the notice and camping. You have to make that analysis, and then of course small issues, but things like, is it the city's right-of-way versus the state's right-of-way, controlled by the Department of Transportation, or maybe it's a private property owner's. The lines aren't painted out there necessarily where all these property lines and rights of way are identified. So sometimes it depends on where a person is, and we have to go through that whole analysis. We are working to continue to expand this effort, and council has, I approached City Council, I think it was last month, it must have been because now it's August already, in July, about hiring 2 additional positions here in Golden that could help with resources in this area. One is focused on affordable housing, which is not homelessness per se, but it's a related issue, and how we can achieve more policy development in that area, seek grant opportunities that are out there, and I think we would benefit greatly from that resource, one that we currently do not have internally. And the other is to work on adding additional resources for our Homeless Navigator program. You heard from Rebecca. I think that program works really well. Unfortunately, her time is constrained between 3 different cities, and so there's a lot of work between identifying people, talking to them, building those relationships, and then offering whatever help their situation might dictate. So those are 2 things we're working on, and we'll be working on immediately as getting those positions into place. And then lastly, it's a small thing, and I'll just mention this, but one of the things that we started to do internally for our management team and department directors is to hold a regular standing weekly meeting, as this is one of our topics, and a meeting dedicated just on this topic. So it is on the forefront of our minds, and we can continually review our city's involvement and ways that we can continue to help address this issue. So those are some of the things I wanted to just mention to you. I'll leave the balance of the discussion to Commander Williams, because what's important to note is, that the police department often is called upon in these situations to handle a situation, and they get put in some incredibly difficult spots of trying to both balance community issues and also the rights and needs of individuals who may be experiencing homelessness. So Commander Williams, I'd like you to share with those here some of the experiences you've all had and some of the challenges.
Good evening, everyone. Hope you can hear me okay. Drew Williams, obviously commander of the police department here. So yeah, as Jason said, it's I think what we want you to know from the police department is this tremendous struggle, I guess I would say, between a social welfare issue and law enforcement, and where do we stand with this particular issue. Our philosophy in the police department in the city has been to provide the highest quality of service we can to all members of our community. We're here to reduce crime and the fear of crime. And these particular issues, it's not always clear-cut, as you have learned in the last hour and a half, that it's very complex. And our function is there to enforce law, limited in some aspects to what we can provide to folks, many times based upon what we're seeing or what we're coming across in these encounters. And so it seems very simple. It's ironic we went last tonight. We're usually the first one that gets called, right, when something like this comes up. Is that, I need you to handle this problem. And quite frankly, sometimes it's not a problem. It is very legal, what's occurring, and I think it just is at times for folks a struggle. May not be the appearance we want to see, or maybe some confusion, as you've heard, or I just don't believe that belongs in my community. It might be a personal belief. However, they are entitled to rights, and that's what we're after, to make sure we're ensuring everyone's rights. You heard specifically about 4 amendments that are very complex, that just sit right out in front of you when you're trying to contact individuals. And so for us, it's very simply, could be quite frankly showing up and making an assessment and not even contacting the individual. Could be to contacting the individual and seeing, what is occurring. Is there a crime that has occurred? Maybe, maybe not. If a crime has occurred, still deciding if that's the appropriate measure to take. Is that either a verbal warning, or are we going to write a citation, or are we going to make an arrest? So the officers are challenged with trying to go through a vast amount of information and legalities to try to make the proper step. And then in the end, what is the goal? How are we really improving the situation? So, if we write a ticket, it's monetary. You've heard the struggle when it comes to monetary. Can they afford a ticket? Can they afford to be introduced in the criminal justice system if I'm going for housing, if I'm going for vouchers, so I need to have a criminal record on something that's very minor? And then even jailing them. Frankly, we're under jail restrictions as it sits right now with many severe cases, let alone minor municipal charges in these cases, as far as maybe, let's say, a littering or impeding a sidewalk. And so we balance those. It seems like a simple solution: call the cops and get rid of them. Right now, I'll tell you what you can experience across the country, right, is it worth it, right? What I mean by that is the choice to encounter, let's just say it's somebody sleeping across the sidewalk. This individual is unknown to us, and let's just say they have violent tendencies. That encounter, because they're sleeping across the sidewalk, could escalate into a potential use of force, right? So what are you seeing cross country where they escalate, things get out of control, and then you see a use of force? And is it really solving the problem to encounter the individual, like I said, over blocking or impeding a sidewalk that ends up getting any use of force? So they might have a weapon on them, they might turn on the officer, then heaven forbid it turns into a lethal encounter over a relatively minor issue. And so we're always balancing that. Like I tell you, here in Golden, the vast majority of ours are protective, as they should be. You heard safety is our #1 concern. So very regularly there's a weapon associated to them. It may be a manufactured or it may be an actual weapon, but they are safeguarding themselves from the unknown. And so that obviously is an encounter with us. We're worried about an encounter with us. Another thing is just kind of repeating the cycle. So we put them in there, they get, jail, come back out, then they miss, and they go back out, they have a warrant issued for them. So it's just this kind of repetitive cycle that goes over and over. And so our balance is trying to be collaborative, as you're seeing here in the city. What resources do we have to bring to bear to try to solve some of these very difficult situations? Golden, we have about 103 homeless that we've identified. Right now, we're up about, I think it's 225 in contacts with those 103 individuals. They've generated 278 crime reports, basically, out of that, or CRs, what we call them. And so it is taking up a good period of our time. We have a unit that is dedicated to this. I have 3 officers that are assigned in our Community Resource Officer Division that are responsible for homelessness, mental health, and outreach. And this is how we are trying to tackle some of the solutions that are coming up. Ideas that are moving forward with the city and in the state design and the county design for try to help this issue of homelessness. But again, I think our philosophy that we're trying to take here is a low-level approach as best as we can, improve upon the situation. A good example to dive into is Highway 58 in Washington. So you see, those of you in the community here know there's a very visible presence that's up there. Jason alluded a little bit to some of our challenges. So we have some city-owned property up there. We have some state-owned property up there. So it takes collaboration. We recently posted some signs. If you go up there, you will see where there's no trespassing signs allowed now that we've collaborated with the state. We've also spent outreach time with our folks that frequent that area, educated them on the laws. I was just up there Friday, and they are clearly understanding what they can and can't do in that particular area. And if they're doing what they're allowed to do, we leave them be. If there's something like an open container, or they're drinking, or there's drug use, or there's a fight, or there's something that comes up, of course we're going to handle the criminal issue. Just understand the challenges and decisions that officers are forced with making. Again, is it going to help the situation? Am I going to end up in an encounter that may or may not be worth it in the end? I think it's some of the challenges you all should be aware of that we're facing.
Thanks, Drew. These are complex issues, and I hope that tonight you've been able to learn a little bit from all the folks that have been able to speak here about some of the challenges, some of the issues, some of the efforts we're making to try to have a positive influence on this issue. If it were easy, it would be solved already. Right, and we all know. I think we all understand that, and our goal is really to balance the needs of our community, the health, safety, and welfare of our community, and those of the individuals themselves who are entitled to the same thing. And it's not always easy. So I know we're a little past our time, but I wanted to first thank you all for being here. But second, to see if anybody had questions they had for us, for anybody who spoke here tonight. I think we still have the folks on our screen. So is there anything that you're wondering that we weren't clear on, that you'd like some more information on? We're happy to answer those. Yes, sir.
Hold on, I'm going to do my best Phil Donahue here.
Okay. Diane, you have to say, caller. Can you hear me, caller?
Hi, my name is Bill Simpson. I live at 815 9th Street. I'm here tonight because about 2 years ago, we had a temporarily homeless person break into our home, menace my wife, and attack me with a baseball bat and brandish a butcher knife that he'd pulled off our counter. And so I've thought a lot about homelessness and about what can and cannot be done. And so one of the things that I didn't hear tonight and I wanted to hear more about was about what the police department is doing with mental health holds. Because with our guy, a couple of things happened. He's down at Pueblo now for the foreseeable future. He pled guilty or innocent by reason of insanity and got sent down there. And he'd been going to a community mental health center in Denver, and he had a nurse that he liked, and he'd been getting 2 medications for his schizophrenia. One was covered by Medicaid, the other wasn't. The nurse was comping him with samples for the second medication. Okay, so she quit. He didn't have a rapport with the center, and he went homeless and went off both his medications and ended up in our kitchen.
Yeah.
Okay, and he had been around the city of Golden during the day, and the city of Golden had several encounters with him. And because of his paranoia, every encounter that he had with the police escalated him further. And so I know that you've had some conversations about being more prospective with mental health holds, and so I want to hear more about that. Thank you.
Yeah, first, I'm sorry about your encounter, but thank you for asking the question. And so mental health holds, there's strict criteria for us to place somebody under a mental health hold. It's us and a physician, actually. So they have to be a danger to themselves or the public or greatly disabled, right? So the officer is challenged with making sure they meet that criteria. So in these cases where you might see us encounter somebody who might not meet that criteria right away, for us to essentially take your liberties away for you for up to 72 hours in that instance. In Golden, what I can tell you, which is pretty rare, is that every single one of our officers is required to go to crisis intervention training, so it's a CIT training. So every single one of our officers, even the chief down, is trained in CIT. So we have advanced knowledge on how to communicate and deal with mental health. You've heard briefly about how we have a mental health co-responder. So that's been the new addition that we've had here in the last year or so. And so when these calls come out, that co-responder is trained, obviously more advanced than the law enforcement officer is, and they accompany the officer out to a scene if it's safe to do so. So in the case of this to your home, and that obviously wouldn't be a safe scene for that person until we got that under control. But that is what the police department is doing to make sure that we have added tools, and that's kind of what you're seeing in the community, is how to get more expertise, more mental health expertise immediately to the scene as quickly as we can to make an assessment. Like I spoke to earlier, our tools are pretty limited. It's pretty, enforcement driven, or in this case, once we have a cause to put you on a hold, then of course we would try to do that cause and put somebody that's there. What happens, frankly, what happens from the minute we transport to the hospital and what happens at the hospital beyond varies extremely different. I would love to be able to tell you that everybody we put in, is there for a period of time. Frankly, sometimes as quickly as we turn around, they're coming back out the door. So it's kind of that assessment that is kind of working its way through. So that's how you see repeated issues sometimes in the community. Our officers are doing their best to deal with it the first time they encounter. But in a mental health issue, it's not a crime, potentially. If a crime is committed, of course they're going to deal with the crime, make an arrest, deal with those situation, and then mental health comes in after the fact. But if it's strictly a situation where somebody's not acting right or a situation looks suspicious, it's going to take a lot to elevate them to a hold status. Does that answer your question, or do you have more specific?
I kind of follow up on that. I'm sure sure you're aware of what Denver is doing. I'm sure you're aware of what Denver's doing with their STAR program, and that's based on something out of Eugene, Oregon called Cahoots. Mm-hmm. And for those of you who don't know, what it is they have a team of a social worker and a paramedic. Mm-hmm. And when a call comes into dispatch, then the dispatcher makes a choice. Is this a paramedic call? Is this a fire department call? Is it a police call? Is it a Cahoots call? Yep. And so one of the things that I'd like to see in Jefferson County generally is something more like Cahoots, where people are actually doing this. And a lot of times we like to say that the problem of homelessness is difficult and insoluble, when what we're really saying is that it's expensive. And what we're really saying is it's expensive and we have other funding priorities. And that's why you find various people saying, oh, we have all these sort of third sector things we do, like churches and and charities of various sorts, and we do that. And what that really tells me is, well, that just means that we don't want to pop for it ourselves as society. And so you're going to have these idiosyncratic and not funding secure programs that go into place and go out of place again, and so really it's like my other thought about this is, well, what solves problems? Money. And I think a really lovely use of the marijuana money that we hopefully will be getting in the future will be for paying for a nice Cahoots van. Mm-hmm.
Other questions for any of our panelists? Yes, ma'am.
Have a fund to expand upon this?
So the question was, and she's only bringing the microphone around because we're recording the session, but the question was, does Golden have a fund to address homelessness specifically?
No, just any of the homeless programs. I mean, I know the police you have resources for some of your officers, mm-hmm. but all of the things that you've talked about today, is there a budget to address any of the homeless issues?
Yes. So, and I say that in that fashion just because it's not a broken out fund within our budget to address homelessness, but we do have specific programs within our budget that do address some of these issues. So, for example, our contributions towards regional navigation, trash and cleanup kind of issues, maybe it's supporting the safe parking program. Those things we have in our budget, and we will be adding the two positions I referenced as part of our budget next year permanently, and this year we'll do it via a budget amendment so we can incorporate the dollars for those positions. Matt, I'll call on you first, and then it was kind of a tie.
Matt Finley. What I've heard tonight is encouraging, and I've learned a lot, but I don't want Golden to become a sanctuary city where everyone just flocks here because we're handing things out. I've watched the church parking lot over there. I figured all that out by myself. I've watched the cars increase. Have you guys looked at Denver and all their mistakes from Hickenlooper and Hancock and how that city's gone down in the past 10 years, how Aurora's turning, how other major cities, I mean, I think it's great that we're addressing this, talking about it, but there's a lot of mistakes that have been made by communities that have some enforcement and help, and in other communities that just throw money at it, like somebody just said. Throw money at stuff doesn't solve anything except bankrupt the government. So that's my concern, and the other concern is I'm a property owner in Golden. This is a tragic story this gentleman said, It's amazing that all these people have all these free pro bono attorneys. Who's going to represent me when someone breaks into my car, attacks my wife maybe on the public sidewalk where we're allowed to move? So it goes both ways, as you're well aware. I expect our police force, which is a wonderful police force, not to have their hands tied, Mr. City Manager, with politically correct ideology. I expect them to come and have the officer's opinion of what's going on that scene and not have some opinion that we don't want to offend anybody or we don't want to end up on the news. So I know it's difficult, but no one talked about the lawful abiding citizens of Golden that have worked all their lives for their properties, and when we have an issue, we want the police to come and help us resolve it. So I know it's difficult, but I hope, like I said, that we don't want to open the door in Golden. I don't. And a lot of these great charity organizations require a little bit of input on the client, as you call them, to come back. So instead of just handing them a food voucher, maybe they have to come to a meeting. Maybe they have to attend something. Maybe they have to, there's some accountability. That's what helps human nature grow. So thank you.
Well, Matt addressed a few of my concerns as well. I have experienced homelessness in my family for many, many years. I'm probably going to address the 20%, the visible homelessness that we see, in the sense that I experienced that for part of my life with my family. And I want to say that living in that and around encampments, although they weren't quite what they are today, largely what I saw was drug use and mental health problems. And I don't know necessarily if you would call it a choice to be there, but definitely a lack of trying to leave that situation. So, like I said, I'm very happy that we're having these conversations. I've also traveled the United States for my job, and I've seen cities that I don't want to call them handouts, but make it safer for drug abusers and alcoholics, and to some extent people with mental health problems to survive in that situation without having to seek help. And those cities have massive problems. And like I said, I'm not talking about the 70% transitional that are there. It's just the more visible. And I'm no expert, but it seems like people with diseases. So alcohol, I think, is a disease, and it needs to be addressed probably in an institution, so or a hospital or something like that. But I would like to see, with regards to the church parking lot, I think that's possibly a good idea. Maybe limits, or maybe they are in contact with the homeless guidance representative. I apologize, I forget the name of that, but because it can be a long process. But if we don't set limits on vouchers and stipends and free things, we will have a much bigger problem in our city, along with all the other ones I've seen. And so I hope we can keep that in mind as well. So, yeah, thank you.
I should have mentioned, related to that program specifically, that there are limits to it, both time frames that they can be there, and also there's an application process they have to go through. They have to go through background checks and be interviewed to make sure that they're a right fit for that program. Yes, ma'am. Oh, I'm sorry. We'll go here and then we'll come to you.
Okay, I'm Susan Odie. I'm the pastor at First United Methodist Church that hosts the safe parking, and I wanted to respond to that and say that there are limits. We background check everybody. We have turned people away that we felt like were not a good fit for this community. Usually those are people who have extensive history of violence, gun use, or people who are in who are using drugs currently and not ready to seek help. So there are those limits. We are working actively with the police. We have a very good relationship with them. And we have Rebecca come out. I mean, she said she comes out every Thursday. We have somebody from the mental health center coming out every Thursday, building relationship with our guests, trying to figure out how we can serve them so that those people that do struggle with mental health issues have access to medication, to therapy, to the people and the services that they need without having to go to Denver, without having to go to Wheat Ridge, without having to travel so far, because this is their comfort zone. Most people that we're serving do not have a car, or the people in safe parking have a car and have no money for gas. And so their ability to move is limited by that. So I would encourage anybody who has questions about safe parking, who has concerns about safe parking, who is worried about the feeding program that we're doing at the church for people who live unsheltered, please come and talk to me. I'd be glad to share with you what we're doing, why we're doing it, and how we're trying to not give handouts to people, but we are trying to make sure that their basic daily needs are met. Because you cannot go look for a job if you can't take a shower. You cannot go look for a job when you're worried about what you're going to eat. You cannot go look for a job when you have no idea where you can put your belongings without somebody stealing your birth certificate, your driver's license, everything that you own. They're huge struggles. So, thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, we had a question here.
Thank you. It just seems that every time opportunity comes up to provide safe homes, apartment buildings, like the Episcopalians have done in Denver, where everybody has to pay in something from whatever income they have, Social Security, disability, whatever, but they have a safe place. But the example that I can't forget is, I think it was 2019, when the Coalition for the Homeless wanted to put up apartments on the federal property, and the city of Lakewood, and if it had been in Golden probably would have done the same thing, just rose up in a huge, shaming. Don't you think we're putting those people near us, and we don't want it. And that's pretty much the response when groups do want to try to provide safe places of any kind.
Real quickly, I've had an opportunity to work with some of the homeless through the Methodist Church. I can make a recommendation for everybody. It's about relationships. And I have to admit, I had a big fear factor after having seen some of the behaviors. I have made some wonderful friends through some of our folks that come for meals, and we help provide clothes at the Methodist Church. I can now call them friends, many of them. They don't have a fear of me, and my fear of them has lessened. I am learning about their behaviors. I understand certain topics that I can and cannot talk to them about. And I really, really encourage people, when you pass someone on the street, say hello, don't turn away. They are members of our community. I had one gentleman that I got some socks for, handed them to him the other day after I had seen him the previous day. I told him about the services that are available in Golden. And his comment to me when I went back that next day with one pair of socks was, "Thank you, it is so nice to be remembered and be seen."
I remember when President Reagan got up and told us that we have no right to house people that don't want to be housed in hospitals. We let everybody out of the mental institutions, as they called them at the time. My father, when he retired, founded a homeless shelter, not a shelter, but a day care center for people. They could come and get clean socks. They could take a shower. But the majority of the problems were the guys, primarily men, I'm sorry, who were happy to take a shower, happy to have a donut and a cup of coffee, but they were not going to buy into the system. They'd been living on the streets. We covered up the campground where half of our homeless people lived on the west side of 6th Avenue. People probably didn't even know they were people camping over there. These people had been able to live independently to a certain extent, but when the people were released from the mental hospitals, they'd come to the daycare my father had founded, get their drug prescriptions, go out for the next week, and they weren't gone a day before their drugs were stolen from them. And these are really difficult issues. And these are not members of our community necessarily. They've ended up here. And that's my other concern, as you said, you provide for people and more people show up. How do we, you have the parking at the church, you say you have to turn people away. Where do they go when you turn them away?
Yeah.
They're not driving back down to Denver. So
it's a phone interview system.
They're not physically
here.
here.
The lot is until they're accepted.
Okay. But eventually the word will get around, because they do talk to each other. I feel there is a need to take care of some people, but we need to also house people in facilities where they can be cared for. I have a son living in Australia, and we had this discussion recently, and he said, I would rather pay $200 a year more in taxes and know that I can walk downtown in Denver safely than have to worry about getting knifed in a parking lot. So that's both sides of it.
Anybody else? I know we went past our time significantly, but I do hope that you all valued the conversation here and we're able to at least walk away having learned something about the challenges, the issues that are out there, and the role we try to play in it. Thank you so much for being here, and wish you a good evening, and hopefully this isn't the last we all see you on this topic. Have a good night. Thank you, Jason. Thank you.